Hello, I'm Farrell Hoy Janab, Director of the Kansas Studies Institute at Johnson County Community College. Welcome to this introduction to an underappreciated part of the Sunflower State. While Kansas has a rich history, most attention is paid to the conflicts over slavery in the 1850s or the expansion of the agricultural frontier after the Civil War. Most Kansans do not connect the history of the state to the mining industry, conflicts between labor and management, or even the Civil War. But if you visit the southeastern corner of the state and you know where to look, these complex histories await. In some places, these stories are told in museums, staffed by passionate volunteers who fear the loss of the past. In other places, these stories are harder to unearth as they involve causes now unpopular or environmental legacies that have consumed entire communities. This documentary provides a glimpse at some of the stories of southeastern Kansas as seen through the eyes of a group of Johnson County Community College faculty and staff who visited the area in 2015. This trip was co-sponsored by the Kansas Studies Institute and the Center for Sustainability at JCCC. The trip leaders, Dr. Jim Leiker and Dr. Jay Andel, have been conducting these tours since 2011, and it is their voices you will hear next.
The first stop on the tour was at the Mine Creek battlefield site near Pleasanton, Kansas. This was an important battle that took place on October 25, 1864. The site is operated by the Kansas State Historical Society. While most Kansans are somewhat familiar with the Bleeding Kansas period of the 1850s, when the future of the place as a free state was secured, many are not as familiar with the various Civil War battles that occurred on both sides of the Missouri border.
We are here at the Mine Creek battlefield to talk about the impact of the Civil War on this part of Kansas. And what we can see here is the examples of the kinds of artillery pieces and the rifles and the pistols that were used in combat here. You can learn about, in many ways, just how disorganized and chaotic Civil War battles really were, and learn just really how divided Kansas was. And we think about the 1850s, the period of Bleeding Kansas and the conflict over slavery, but really that continues down here with neighbor fighting against neighbor throughout the entire Civil War. And you certainly have that happening here in southeastern Kansas, where you're very close to the Missouri border. The Mine Creek battlefield site, which is just outside this visitor center, is one of the larger cavalry battles of the entire Civil War. And so for people who are interested in Kansas history or the Civil War, or for that matter, just the sort of the minutia of military history, like what were the largest cavalry battles in the Civil War, this is a good place to come. And for those of us on this trip, it reminds us that the history of southeastern Kansas is not just about mining or labor disputes, although we'll be concentrating on that, but there are many other issues involved as well. What we have here is an interesting artifact at the Mine Creek battlefield site. This is a 1807 horse pistol. It's basically a flintlock musket, is effectively what it is. And it's interesting not just because it is original 1807, and it would be the kind of weapon that a few people here, particularly the Confederate side, might have actually had on them at the time of the battle itself. But there's an interesting piece of Kansas history that's not so obvious when you pick up the piece. If you look at, now I need to find it here on the side of the gun, it's identified as Harper's Ferry Armory 1807. The Harper's Ferry Armory was in Virginia, and that's actually the site that John Brown and his followers tried to take over in 1859 as one of their attempts to instigate a civil war and to seize weapons to arm slaves in the South. And it was that seizing of Harper's Ferry by John Brown and his followers that was one of the last straws that convinced many Southerners that they could not remain in the Union and helped lead to the American Civil War. So there's a lot going on with this pistol, and this is why artifacts matter at historic sites like the one we have here at Mine Creek.
While Fort Scott did serve as a post for the Union Army during the Civil War, Its heyday came during the frontier period from 1842 to 1853. The JCCC group visited the Fort Scott National Historic Site, which has been controlled by the National Park Service since 1978. We're at National Historic Site at Fort Scott, Kansas. And the reason why we include this on the tour is because it's part of our educational experience relating to Bleeding Kansas and the Civil War. Fort Scott is located pretty close to the Missouri border, and it's located on the old military highway that used to connect Fort Leavenworth to Fort Scott, and then heading down further south to Fort Gibson, Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. But Fort Scott was operative especially in the 1840s during the U.S.-Mexican War, when the United States acquired practically all of the current southwest corner of the United States. So this area would have had a lot of cavalry, infantry, dragoons, who were tunneling through here on the way toward the southwest and eventually on toward war with Mexico. As you get into the 1850s of the Bleeding Kansas period, Fort Scott at various times was occupied both by Union and Confederate forces, certainly during the Civil War. And you see some of that tension between the two armies being played out here in the town of Fort Scott itself. But for most of that time, Fort Scott was operated by the U.S. Army. But as you can see, Fort Scott is currently maybe the best preserved fort in Kansas. You might put Fort Larned at the top of that, but it's a wonderful look at what it was like for the life of the 19th century soldier, and a good way to study Kansas history. We're here on the second floor of one of the buildings at Fort Scott National Historic Site, and this would have been the enlisted men's barracks. And as you can see, these were beds that were made for two. Actually, the bunk would have been made for four. You would have had two men on the top, two men on the bottom, and they slept head to toe, which means this fellow's head would have been here, and right at this spot would have been the other fellow's feet. So I'm sure that made for some interesting sleeping conversations. At any rate, there was one regiment stationed here during the 1850s and 1860s. Typically, a regiment was about 1,000 men, and within that you would have had somewhere between 8 to 9 companies. The companies typically were somewhere between 100 and 120. So a company of soldiers would have probably been segregated into one barracks by themselves. And since these were dragoons, oftentimes you would have had soldiers with equipment that was relevant for the cavalry. So they would have had their muddy equipment, they would have had their saddles, anything that they needed for taking care of their horses, oftentimes were stuffed underneath these bunks. So this would have been quite the nasty, smelly place, but for a lot of soldiers, this was home for the short time that they were on the frontier.
Traveling south into Bourbon, Cherokee, and Crawford counties, the tour entered the heart of mining country in Kansas. While there was also substantial coal mining in Osage County from 1869 to 1885, the areas around Pittsburgh became the most important coal mining region of the state. The Weir-Pittsburgh coal bed produced over 200 million tons, beginning with the small-scale underground mining of the Scammon Brothers in 1874, all the way through the end of the steam shovel-driven surface strip mining in the early 1970s. As the scale of shaft mining grew in the 19th century, so did the number of small communities of miners that grew up around those shafts. Over the course of the mining era, over 100 of these mining communities were built. Few remain today. By World War I, close to 10,000 people were toiling in the coal mines, many of whom were immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. This diversity led to this area being labeled as the Little Balkans. Further, the scale of the mining industry as well as deplorable working conditions led to repeated attempts to organize the miners into unions over the objections of the mine owners. The resultant labor disputes provided fertile ground for more radical labor organizations to recruit, as well as socialist ideas to take root. This mining heritage and the ethnic diversity, along with more radical ideas, distinguished this part of Kansas from the rest of the state. The center of this radical political activity was Girard, the seat of Crawford County, where the socialist newspaper The Appeal to Reason was published. Today, when socialism is considered to be clearly un-American, one really has to know where to look to unearth this particular part of this town's history.
Girard is famous for another reason. This was the site of the second largest socialist publishing house in the country. So back in the late 19th, early 20th century, socialism was quite strong in mining areas. The first real publishing house here that specialized in socialist printing was started by J. Wayland back in the 1890s. And that was his house, I believe, that we passed when we came in from the north with the door hanging open. Wayland operated a press here called The Appeal to Reason. That was actually the name of a weekly newspaper that was widely circulated across the United States. He had all sorts of people on staff. And if you notice a little bit down there, that was where the original post office is still located. So Girard had such an enormous printing business going on here, and they were sending out these booklets all across the country, that they hired lots of extra staff and eventually got this extra good-sized post office built. And we're standing on what's called Press Block. So if you notice the building right across the street, 1884, this would have been the center of Wayland's little empire. If you're familiar with the 1906 book, The Jungle, which is an expose of the Chicago meatpacking industry, it's an American classic. That was actually first published down here in Girard in serial form. And that basically went on until about 1915, I want to say, when Wayland committed suicide. And after that, his press was bought by an interesting couple named Emmanuel and Anna Haldeman Julius. He was from New York originally, New York or Philadelphia, I forget which, and she was a Girard local. Her father owned the local bank, and her aunt was Jane Addams, who was the famous reformer and had Hull House in Chicago. So she came from a family that was very interested in issues relating to immigrants, labor, radical ideas, and so forth. But when he moved out here as a writer in the World War I period, he married Anna, and then they bought the company from Wayland, or at least from his estate, and operated it well into the 1920s. So during that time, one of the things that they expanded into, besides the weekly Appeal to Reason, was a periodical called the Little Blue Books. And these are still famous among Kansas archivists and historians. They were just tiny little blue books, essentially 5 by 7 inches, I think is the size. And they put out tons of these things. Thousands of them went out all across the country. And they recruited intellectuals, writers, radicals to write for them. So some of the folks who came here to Girard writing for their press, as well as gave lectures here, would have been people like Clarence Darrow, one of the founders of the ACLU. Jack London was here at one point, the author of Call of the Wild. A lot of political figures like Eugene Debs was here, Mother Jones, Emma Goldman. So Girard was really considered a little hub of radical subversive activity. And what made all of that possible, what brought in all of these people with leftist ideas, was the proximity of the mines. So we'll talk about this a little bit later when we get to the Franklin Museum. Emmanuel and Anna got divorced, I want to say, in the 1920s, but he stayed in the town. He still continued to operate the press, and it kept shrinking in size until his death in the 1950s. He married a much younger woman, never left Girard, and he died accidentally somehow in a swimming pool on his house, which is, I think, what we're going to drive by on the way to Franklin after we leave here. The question that's always intrigued me on this spot is why is there nothing here commemorating the history of socialism in Girard? I mean, in the 1920s, Kansas takes this pretty radical turn to the right. It becomes the kind of conservative place that we know today. But still, you look around, you would think that there's some commemoration of it. And nobody's ever really studied that or written about it, but my best guess is that during the 20th century, because of the Cold War, this virulent anti-communism that you saw in the United States just gave locals a lot of incentive to try to forget the socialist past here as much as possible. One mining town in the coal region was Franklin. Its post office opened in 1908, and its population during the heyday of the underground coal mining period was close to 2,000 people. As the industry shifted to less labor-intensive surface strip mining, the town's fortunes suffered, and today there are around 375 residents. But those residents are deeply committed to telling the stories of the community and its mining heritage. These stories are on display at the Franklin Miners Museum that opened in 2012, which includes the story of the December 1921 Amazon Army, where thousands of miners' wives marched in support of their husbands who were on strike. This area that we're in, Crawford County, between about 1890 and 1920 was a heavy coal-producing area, and where we'll be tomorrow in Cherokee County around Baxter Springs was primarily lead and zinc. So I'm just going to take a second to talk about the importance of those products during that time. Coal, of course, was the driving engine behind the Industrial Revolution. Lead and zinc was primarily going up in value and therefore demand during World War I, because lead, of course, was the chief ingredient in bullets and artillery, and zinc was used to form metal casings. So some of those chat piles that you'll see tomorrow, that's actually the cost of European battlefields that you're seeing down in that area. In 1931, which is a little bit after the peak of the coal period here in Crawford County, there was an English teacher at Pittsburgh State University who recorded 31 different languages being heard on the streets of Pittsburgh. And that's because of the heavy influx of immigrants that were brought into this area starting in the 1890s. So lots of Eastern Europeans, Italians, Czechs, Slovenians, but also Western Europeans like French. One census report I've seen shows Canadians, Mexicans, so you had a little hodgepodge of people from all over the world living in these different camps. And every little mining camp had its own particular ethnic flavor, and some of those coal camps morphed into actual communities, and Franklin was one of those communities. Now, where we just were in Girard, where we talked about the socialist influence, a lot of these immigrants had already had an experience with radical activity, with anarchism back in their own country, so they brought those ideas with them when they arrived in Kansas. A lot of what they're being brought here, frankly, for is cheap labor. And why that disappears in the 1920s, shortly after World War I, is that the big mining companies started to use special kind of coal cutting equipment. That is, instead of sending guys climbing around on their knees and their elbows with a pick in a shaft about this wide, you could actually use machines to cut through the edge of the cave walls. And so, just like everything else in modern America, mechanization sort of eliminates the need for human labor. Now, that's not going to be the case where we'll be later this afternoon and tomorrow. They're still doing the old-fashioned kind of mining there for a while. One thing that's often forgotten here in Crawford County is that the Ku Klux Klan was very common in the 1920s. Pittsburgh and Girard had two of the largest Klan chapters in the United States. So one account says that there was a Klan rally held on private property somewhere out in this vicinity between Franklin and Mulberry, and the cars were lined up for miles to turn into the field. And supposedly there were burning crosses in the southern part of Pittsburgh nightly for about a year in 1924. I've always been curious as to why the Klan was so strong in Crawford County and not so much in Cherokee, which you would think that that would have a stronger Klan presence because it is a little farther south. They share a border with Oklahoma. And I think the reason is that the Klan here was more anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, rather than anti-black. I mean, they had that element about them, but it was more, I think, a reaction by white Protestants to all of the immigrants that were arriving here. Something else that's interesting is that the Klan tended to do a lot of recruiting among socialists and labor union types. Some of the work I've done, I've discovered that the Klan was surprisingly fairly populist. That is, they used the language of anti-government, anti-corporation, and that appealed to a lot of coal miners. So some very strange things happening socially and politically in this part of Kansas. It's hard to classify them all the time as liberal or conservative. They really transcend both of those. Further south near West Mineral in Cherokee County, the group visited one artifact of the shift in technology that brought about the decline of towns like Franklin. Big Brutus, an enormous electrically driven shovel, removed the shallow overburden, revealing the coal beneath. Now open as part of a privately run museum, visitors can go up into the shovel that sits at the end of the last trench that it dug. Throughout parts of Cherokee, Crawford, and Labette counties, visitors can see the lasting impacts of these trenches on more than 14,500 acres of land that are now owned by the state of Kansas in various sections of what's called the Mined Over Land Wildlife Area. Well, I'm inside the big scoop shovel of Big Brutus, and literally I'm just a drop in the bucket here. This is really, for a lot of the participants on the weekend, the favorite part of the trip, because we're visiting the Big Brutus steam shovel. This is an iconic part of the era that is located in Crawford County, and it gives everybody a good sense of the machinery-based era of mining, what we call strip mining. So Big Brutus was in operation from the early 1960s until about 1974, which is a relatively short time period, really. And the cool thing is that when you go inside the shovel itself, you get a sense of the massive space, the cavernous spaces that these miners worked in on a daily basis. It really gives you a good sense of the scale of industrial America at that time. Participants really love this part because they can sit in the operator's chair, they can look out over the landscape and try to get a sense of what it was like back in the day. But even so, it's really hard to replicate what this would have been like half a century ago. This would have been loud, lots of big open pits filled with dust. There would have been rails moving ore in and out of here. So tomorrow, where we'll be in Cherokee County, we'll be looking at how miners were down in small little crevices doing lead and zinc. But today, this is really a day to see the large-scale type of machinery-based mining that happened here in the thick coal seams.
On the second day of the tour, the JCCC group turned its attention to the legacy of a different kind of mining, lead and zinc. The extreme southeastern part of the state was part of the Tri-State Mining District. Lead was mined near modern Joplin, Missouri as early as 1838, with production moving to also include zinc. Again, the first commercial ore discovery in the district was made in southwestern Missouri around 1838. By the start of the American Civil War, these mines were producing so much lead that both the North and South fought to control the mining area to secure a source of lead for bullets. The fighting closed the mines for most of the war. But in terms of warfare, according to the Kansas Geological Survey, production in the tri-state peaked between the two world wars. And at its peak, more than 11,000 miners worked in the area, with many more involved in support work and industries. Before the final mine closed just west of Baxter Springs, Kansas in 1970, the Kansas part of the Tri-State District produced more than 2.9 million tons of zinc, with an estimated value of well over $400 million and over 650,000 tons of lead worth close to $100 million. Most of this mining was done underground, with the digging out of vast chambers and the pouring of post-processing waste onto the surface in what became known as chat piles. In order to keep these mines open, vast quantities of water had to be pumped out of the mines. Once these mines began to close in the 1960s and 70s, water came to fill the mines, and that water, contaminated with mining waste, began to fill local streams like Tara Creek in Pitcher, Oklahoma, just south of the Kansas line. Concerns about lead contamination combined with growing threats of undermined areas collapsing into sinkholes led first to the Environmental Protection Agency giving Superfund designation to the Pitcher, Oklahoma area, and later the buyout of this community as well as neighboring Trees, Kansas. Galena, Kansas also suffers from the threat of mining-related sinkholes. The mining history of this area is chronicled at the Baxter Springs Historical Museum. While much of the museum is dedicated to the cattle trade and Civil War periods in the town's history, the basement holds true treasures from this tri-state district's history.
We're here in Baxter Springs, and Baxter Springs has several distinct periods in its history, all of which are featured in the museum. Baxter Springs was actually one of the first cattle towns in Kansas because you were having cattle that were being brought up from Texas and ultimately going into Missouri. And for a very short period of time before the Civil War, you actually had that, and right around the end of the Civil War, you had cattle coming through here in large numbers before that trade was ultimately supplanted by places like Abilene beginning in 1867. There's Civil War history here as well. William Clark Quantrill attacks the town, and the town's very proud of its defense of itself against William Clark Quantrill, the same Quantrill who raided Lawrence. But of course, what we're here for is to talk about the impact of the lead and zinc mining on this general area, the Tri-State Mining District, which goes into Missouri and adjacent to Oklahoma. And the museum here at Baxter Springs has acquired most of the records from Pitcher, Oklahoma. So anyone who's doing research on anything in the Tri-State District comes here to look at the research they've got, the photographs, the records of the miners' employment records, the whole lots of maps. So this is one of those museums where there's much more going on than would first seem to the untrained observer if they just saw a building like this. And so we're going to go inside and learn about the Tri-State Mining District. We are in the basement of the Baxter Springs Historical Museum here, where they keep the majority of their mining materials and their fantastic artifacts, maps, photographs. But the map that I'm standing in front of here shows you just the scale of the operations down here in the Tri-State Mining District dealing with lead and zinc. And the area on this map you see in yellow is the area that has been undermined. In other words, that the subsurface mines are of enough scale that it actually does begin to affect the integrity of the surface. So what happens over time, in beginning in the 70s, 80s, up to really through the present, is the gradual recognition that the lead and zinc mining left behind various environmental legacies, whether it be the contamination of soil by lead, or a contamination of water by waste coming out of mines that once were unoccupied, filled with water, and then that water began to run off into surface streams like Tara Creek, or ultimately, as you see on this map, concerns about collapses, about mine shafts collapsing and taking buildings and homes with them. And so all over this part of southeastern Kansas, you have sinkholes that are acres in size as some of these large mine shafts collapse. And also what happened over time, particularly in the early 1970s, is some of the existing pillars that had been left in some of these mine shafts, or these mining areas, themselves were reduced in size to get more lead and zinc out of them. That's even further undermining the support structure, keeping the surface together over these large mines. So one of the legacies of this kind of mining in this part of the state is the sinkholes and concerns about communities and the safety of them, given all this area being literally undermined. And at the end of the day, it was this concern about this area being undermined, which was the final argument that led to support for the buying out of towns like Treese, Kansas, and Pitcher, Oklahoma. So what ultimately led to the total buyout package was not the lead. It was actually concerns about sinkholes and the undermining you see here on this map. Among the many fantastic installations here at the Baxter Springs Historical Museum regarding mining in the Tri-State District, we have these panoramas of the Pitcher, Oklahoma area. And we are going to be leaving here shortly and driving through what is basically now the abandoned town of Pitcher and Carden, Oklahoma. And this wonderful panorama this photograph taken in 1931 shows you how bustling and crowded and populous this area used to be. In fact, we're going to be driving down Connell Street, which is on the right-hand side of this panorama, and there's very little left there today. And we'll drive through almost this entire area that you see in the panorama and see less than probably 10 or 12 buildings total. The rest have been removed, demolished. Most of the chat piles are now also gone, and that chat's been reprocessed into gravel and asphalt. So museums like this serve a critical role to help us interpret the landscape that we see today. Because without these reference images, what we're going to see in Pitcher, Oklahoma later on today would have there'd be no context for us. It would make no sense. And so if anyone is interested in studying the history of the mining region down here, you have to have something to help set the context, to help you show what used to be before you can understand what still is. And these panoramic photographs do a wonderful job of that.
Driving through these towns today is like visiting the apocalypse. Pitcher residents were offered 2 buyouts, with the town officially being dissolved on November 26, 2013. Treese was dissolved by the state of Kansas in 2012. It is impossible to visit these places now without thinking about the unintended consequences of industrial development.
Upon the drive back, participants on the trip reflected on what they had seen. The abandonment of what had been the vibrant communities of Pitcher and Treese led to thoughtful commentary. So too did the pride of southeastern Kansans in trying to preserve the stories of what made their part of the state unique. In this part of Kansas, interactions of people, economy, government, and environment have created rich, complex stories that defy easy telling. Many of these stories do not have happy endings, but such is the human experience, such is history. A trip to southeastern Kansas reminds us of these truths.
We're standing on what was probably a foundation for a house in Pitcher, Oklahoma. It's a very eerie landscape to look around and see the streets of what was probably a little subdivision, and looking at foundations around the area. On the ground just below me are remnants of what would have been a flower pot, an old McCoy flower pot. Behind me is a piece of a broken toilet, some PVC pipe. It truly just looks total devastation. They came in, they cleared off this land, and we see grasses and weeds that are growing around us. It's a very eerie feeling to look around and see what's left, or really what's not here that was here previously. In some ways, it's that cycle of what goes around comes around. The built environment got in the way, and now the land is retaking itself.
As a native coastian, the things that I see when I look around here, it reminds me a lot of home after Katrina. Empty foundations, just sort of driving by and seeing what you know were people's lives, and you can't help but be curious and wonder exactly what you're looking at and what those people did there, and the lives that they lived there. But it's really interesting to me to see a lot of empty foundations here and empty roads, and know that they're not coming back. Whereas when I go home now and I still see empty foundations, 10 years later, I know that eventually people will return to those places.
What strikes me is this is sort of the end of an era, end of a civilizational period where all of this mining took place to support massive social events, wars, industrialization, and this is the end of it. And people, you can look at the grand historical scheme of things, but what we're looking at is, where people were, and we're all sort of speculating, what happened to these people, and what were their reactions to this, and sort of the human toll is something that sometimes we leave out of the abstract picture of history.
This is the Miners Memorial in downtown Pittsburgh, Kansas. The Miners Memorial was put in several years ago. It was the result of a strong community effort to commemorate the contributions of miners to the American economy, especially in Crawford County where coal mining was very strong. So the memorial itself includes the names of those who were killed in industrial mining accidents. It includes plaques, historical markers, some audio describing the activity of labor unions, of mining strikes in this area, also the March of the Amazons, the wives and daughters of mining families in 1920 and 21. We've spent a lot of time talking about social, economic, political factors, all of which are important. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that this affected real people, real lives, real families who were affected. So it's a nice way, I think, to end the trip.